Hello everybody and welcome back to Law Hero. It's time to discuss constitutional law. Now, the first thing you need for constitutional law is your constitution. And I don't even have one to demonstrate to you because I gave it to somebody for their FE1. I can't remember who and I never got it back. So yeah, that's a bummer, but what can you do? Okay, so the second thing I want to discuss is the whole taboo around the constitutional law exam. I remember I was so afraid to do that exam. Part of it was because I actually studied constitutional law through Irish in UCC with Dr. Sean O'Connell, and I didn't have any English notes, so I had to go and get them off someone else, but that was my own personal issue. But I suppose the impetus of constitutional law is an extremely broad course, and that's because the Constitution itself is a pretty hefty document when you think about it, and there's been so much case law down through the years. So if we just get back to the very start, and as I always say, take a broad approach to law, we'll always take a step back, okay? So first and foremost, we go all the way back to the Greeks. We have Plato and Socrates and De Republica, and they came up with the idea of a democratic state. Quite simply, a democratic state is where things are certain. For example, the rule of law is a certainty, and that means that you can have you can rely on the organs of the state to give you due and fair procedure when you are dealing with those organs of the state, and also that there is certainty when you're being tried, for example, or when you go to own property, or when you go to exercise your rights as against the state. So it's all part of the global phenomenon of democracy. And as you know, Ireland is a democracy and our constitution is from 1937, and there's a whole lot of history that goes along with that, which I would advise you to definitely look into, because if you don't understand the context in which the Irish constitution was written, you're going to struggle massively to understand the rationale behind the case law and the wording of our constitution. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing then is to understand, where does the Constitution of Ireland, Bunreacht na hÉireann, where does that fit in our overall legal landscape in Ireland? So we have, as you know, just like any other modern society or legal system, we have public and private law. So your public law is anything to do with the society. For example, criminal law would be a branch of public law. Constitutional law and administrative law are also a branch of public law. Private law then is between citizens. For example, contract law, tort law, although tort can have some public aspects. For example, if you're dealing with the county council and civil liability. Banking would be considered private unless it's a state body, a state-owned body. So the lines can be kind of blurred, but quite broadly, that's the deviation between public and private. So constitutional is public because we're dealing here with how the organs of the state interact with each other. So we have obviously the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, how they interact with each other, and then how the public interact with those organs of state. That is simply what constitutional law is about. And then the constitution comes into it because your rights as a citizen, now, so there is a difference between obviously being a citizen and being a person who is on the island of Ireland, because some constitutional rights pertain to non-citizens. And that nuance is actually very important, and when you're reading the Constitution, try and have regard to that. So your constitutional rights are exercisable as against state organs. For example, when the state is putting a change into the constitution, it requires a referendum from the people. If that's not done properly, you have a claim against the state, a constitutional right to take a claim against the state because the constitution wasn't amended properly. You also have a right to a fair process, due and fair procedure. There's a constitutional element to that when, for example, you are being made, when you're about to lose your job, there are some constitutional aspects there because you have a right to work under the constitution. You also have a right to own property in Ireland. That's a constitutional right. So a lot of the things we take for granted actually are grounded in the constitution. There's also something else to be said for enumerated and unenumerated rights. Some people struggle with this because they sometimes forget that we're a Christian state, and religion plays a massive role in our constitution. And because of that, a lot of our rights are fundamental, which means that they are inherent to our human nature. And that means that there are certain rights that a constitution cannot even give you because they come with the territory, they come with being a human. So for example, breathing, you can't enumerate that in a constitution because how is the constitution going to regulate that? And some unenumerated rights have arisen down through the years, and the judiciary have allowed for this because of natural law. Now, natural law was the beginning of all laws. It is theoreticized in jurisprudence, and if you study the history of law, you'll know this very well, where it came from Thomas Aquinas, it came from Jeremy Bentham, Immanuel Kant. All of these people were legal theorists, and some were proponents of natural law, but it was always agreed that natural law was the fundamental legal system, which means the law that came from God, as in the very, very start, or the difference between right and wrong. It's a morality-based legal theory. So that plays a big role in the interpretation of our constitution. There are other maxims as well which you need to know, because natural law isn't the only theory which has been used to interpret the constitution. Just as regards the exam, so it's a very academic exam, and I would encourage you to really think about every topic that I have put in my ebook, or which you choose to learn of your own accord. Really, so instead, this is one where learning things rote really is going to throw you big time, because the questions he asks are actually very unpredictable. So that the subject matters are predictable, but the way he asks it, especially in the factual questions, are very unpredictable. The essays are actually rather nice because they're very to the point, but the factual questions are quite unpredictable. The factual circumstances can really throw you. And if you're somebody who hasn't really thought about it, hasn't really digested the information around the rights and how rights can be interpreted and what the rights actually mean, what they're trying to protect. I once had, when I was in Germany and we were studying German constitutional law, I remember our professor saying to us, if the state is going to interfere, they must have a damn good reason to do so. And I always took this with me for the rest of my life, really, because that is really the litmus test when it comes to constitutional rights. An example would be, and I discussed this with one of my students, I guess, the other night. for example, the constitutional right to due and fair procedure is tempered by public interest. So yes, we want to give you all of the rights possible as a state when you are in custody. We want to give you a right to silence. We want to give you the right to see a solicitor. You should not be incriminated by your silence, but at the same time we need to protect the public, and especially if one of the crimes you've committed come within the schedule of the Offences Against the State Act 1939. Our state is in danger, and that right trumps your rights to silence and your silence being incriminatory. So that for example is one of the balancing of rights. You know, the state has to look after. When it comes to, you know, property rights, yes, you have a right to property, but it's not so liberal that you can do what you want just because you own somewhere to the detriment of somebody else. And we've seen that in cases with, for example, you know, people being paid market value for their property in compulsory purchase orders, or you know, employers being forced to change around the infrastructure of their business to accommodate people with disabilities, or landlords who may not ever put up the rent, things like this. These are all property rights which may not have, you know, come naturally in your head when you think of property, but property is tangible or intangible. It's not just something that you can stick into the ground. Yeah, I said the reason people, I have here in my notes, the reason I believe people fail questions is because, okay, so let's be reasonable here. As a solicitor, you're never really going to come up against constitutional issues. This would be more an area for barristers. But if your client did ever come to you and there was a constitutional element to their claim, you know, especially if you were practicing as a criminal solicitor, the professional standard of care is that you recognize the constitutional issues, and unfortunately it seems from the exam reports that constitutional issues aren't even being picked up on. So for example, I saw in one of the questions he asked, when it came to you know, a judge telling journalists not to report on a court case, that is not just freedom of speech or freedom of expression, which is Article 40.1. It is also Article 34, which is that that cases should be heard in public, and you know, the public have a right to know what is happening in the judiciary, and you know, what cases are coming before the courts, because it is in the public interest. And there must be a damn good reason for that to be held in camera. In camera means behind closed doors, where there's no journalists allowed, and typically these are family law matters, or if there's, you know, secrets of the state. So there's always these balancing act. This is what the constitutional law course is all about. It's a massive balancing act for the adjudicators, which are the judges. And the separation of powers is a massive balancing act, because, you know, no one power can exceed the other, and that is the essence of a democratic free state. So let me just think, is there anything else I have to cover? I can't believe I did this all in one take. No, I think that's it. Yeah, so if you have any questions on constitutional law, make sure you contact me, info@lawhero.eu. Please continue to follow me on Instagram @lawheroIRL. Just remember, IRL stands for in real life. And yeah, and please subscribe to YouTube if you haven't. And that's it, really. I have nothing else to say. Have a lovely day or evening or whatever you're doing, and happy studying in the FE1s.